Well, welcome everybody to this IceWarm's 7th webinar. Today we have two highly regarded water professionals with much experience with unconventional gas. My name's Trevor Pillar, National Partnerships Manager at IceWarm, and we're so glad to see so many on board already. It's great, so a few more coming on. See that, Alison, Joanna, Kushla, Barry, Catherine, Poetasari, if I said that right, probably not, Poetasari, Rachel, Terry, Thulo, and Yvonne, and more are joining us as we go forward. The format for today is George Gates first up for 12 minutes or so, and then Q&A, and then 12 minutes with Ben, and then Q&A. I want to remind everybody we're recording the webinar, so we'll have a link sent out to everyone afterwards for you and your colleagues to link up with. And then the other thing, last thing I wanted to say was that there'll be a feedback form. It takes about a minute, but it's the main way we shape these future webinars. We'd love to have your feedback for that. I'm going to get underway straight away with George's introduction. But just before I do that, I mentioned asking questions. There is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You'll see that. By all means, begin writing questions immediately, so we can build up toward answering them during the Q&A session. We'd really appreciate that. And if you would like to ask on screen, then put your hand up, and Joel, my colleague here, will make sure that you get both on screen. Anyway, that's enough for introduction. George is Director of Water Management in the New South Wales Office of Water, was responsible for surface and water and groundwater management. Been writing groundwater policy for longer than you can probably remember, and but because of that, he's on the Gateway panel responsible for the expert assessment of state significant mining and coal seam proposals when they're on strategic agricultural land. I won't read any more of that, but you can see from this that George has got a long background in hydrogeology and in policy regarding unconventional gas. So George, I'm going to hand right over to you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you so much for your effort today.
Thanks very much, Trevor. This is my first webinar, so we'll see how it all goes. I'm certainly very enthusiastic about water policy and groundwater policy in general, and probably for the last 10 years I've been particularly interested in policy levers and how that changes people's actions out there on the ground. So I'm going to talk about protecting strategic agricultural land, or SAL as it's sometimes known, and also the proposed changes to the Environmental Planning Assessment Act. So moving on. So what is strategic agricultural land? Well, first of all, there's two types of SAL. There's biophysical SAL, which is the best quality landforms, soils and water resources that are naturally capable of sustaining high levels of productivity, requiring minimal management practices. So this is the best land in New South Wales, in other words. Now there's a second type of SAL called a critical industry cluster. This only has been mapped in the Upper Hunter. Basically, it's localised concentrations of interrelated productive industries based on agricultural products that provides significant employment opportunities and contributes to the identity of the region. So there are two CICs, viticulture and equine culture. So that was really to protect the wine growers and protect the horse breeders. So moving on, these areas have been mapped, and they've been mapped by the government. The government's put out maps for both VSAL and CICs, and you can find those maps if you just look up the regional land use plans. You'll find those maps easily enough. They're done at two scales. They're done at that big regional scale, and they're also done at shire boundary scales. And where coal mining and coal seam gas industry find themselves on any form of significant agricultural land, then you get tossed into a slightly more complicated approvals process. So moving on. So this is the map of a VSAL, so that's a biophysical SAL. This is the best lands the state has to offer. As I say, you can get it at this scale, or you can get it down at the Shire boundary scale, which is more useful. These maps, however, have the normal errors in them that any mapping has, and a proponent that finds themselves on B-cell land can undertake verification to see whether it's true or not. So they have to do quite a bit of work to determine the exact boundaries of B-cell. So moving on. So if you're located on Sal and the answer is yes, we're on some mapped Sal, then you get tossed into this Mining and Petroleum Gateway Panel process. Pardon me. So you're still involved through the EP&A Act, but there's this extra bit of work that has to be done, an extra examining through a scientific panel of your work and the science underpinning the work. So the Gateway Panel is assisted in two areas. One is this criteria listed in the mining set. The Gateway Panel has to consider the applications in front of it according to those criteria. It can't add any criteria or take any away. And there's criteria such as the environment and the economics. The Gateway Panel doesn't look at that. That's dealt with it elsewhere. It does, however, receive advice from the Independent Expert Scientific Committee, which is the Commonwealth Government's science arm. And there's an intergovernment agreement that the state of New South Wales will consider that advice. So that advice comes in to the Gateway Panel, together with advice from Department of Primary Industries, the Water Division. So armed with that advice and what the applicant has put before the panel makes a certificate or issues a certificate, and it can be unconditional. So if it's met all the criteria in the mining SEP, then it's unconditional. If it hasn't met all the criteria, then a conditional certificate is issued, and that'll have additional works to be done in the EIS before the development application goes for approval or otherwise. Those conditions that are highlighted as not fully satisfactory have to be worked on. So we'll move on. Now this is, there's a proposed bill to update the EP&A Act, and it's out in draft form, and it's open for public comment, and the comments are due back by the 10th of March. Now I've only had a look at the part of the bill that interests me, which is the changes for state significant developments. And there's some interesting issues there. For instance, there's a priority to half the time taken to assess applications for state significant developments. The times for complex state significant developments increased from around 600 days in 2008 to almost 1,100 days in 2014. So the government wants to pull this back and have a more reasonable time for approvals or otherwise for state significant developments. So they're proposing to have an independent planning commission, an IPC, to replace the Planning Assessment Commission, known as the PAC. The IPC will make determinations on proposals sent to it by the Minister, as the PAC has done in the past. Public hearings will be held over 2 stages, and there'll be expanded technical expertise. So soil, agricultural science, hydrogeology, economics and mining will be added to this expanded independent planning commission. Now the Mining and Petroleum Gateway Panel, which I'm on, will work within the IPC. That's the proposal. And a lot of this additional expertise will come out of the Gateway Panel. My understanding, you can leave it on that one. My understanding is that because there's 2 public hearings, there won't be any right of review. But you need to get legal advice on that, because I'm not a lawyer. But my reading is if there's 2 public meetings, then you won't get the right of review. The IPC's determination will stand. But as I say, that's my understanding. Now these diagrams just show the current situation in timeline and the proposed situation with a shorter timeline. And if you look at the colours, the applicant in green does the vast majority of work, the planning department in blue is the next work, and the Planning Assessment Commission from the current down to the proposed is a reduced amount of work. So the expectation is there will be between 70 and 160 days savings by this new Independent Planning Commission approach to significant state development proposals. And you can see items 6 and 7 on the bottom bar are the two public hearings listed. So they're quite early on in the piece, and then right at the end, just before the IPC makes its determination. Now, moving on. Now, just with a couple of minutes that I've got left, I suppose there's a lot of work out there, excuse me, on protecting groundwater resources. Probably the most interesting bit of policy work to come out in the last 10 years was the bottom one about aquifer interference policy. That's really worth looking at, because not only does it give you criteria, it gives you guidance on what's minimal impact. And so you know at a glance whether you've exceeded minimal impact. And minimal impact is the only way the state hands out water licenses. It has to meet a minimal impact objective. The other thing worth mentioning is under the New South Wales Gas Plan, there's the water monitoring framework, and there's almost $22 million up for deep drilling into coal basins to find out about baseline conditions and set up a monitoring program, largely before any work is carried out, or in some cases work's already started. So you're looking at the sort of whole framework and what impacts are occurring. But it's deeper monitoring than the government currently does. So the monitoring might go down several hundred metres. And the two areas of interest at the moment, my understanding is the Hunter Valley and the Southern Highlands will have some drilling done there. So moving on. Now, the state government has got a strategic framework that it uses to hand out or sell its petroleum titles, and you can see in 2011 there was a lot of New South Wales covered with petroleum titles. You can see in 2014 it's drawn right back because there's been a buyback by the government, and you can see in the 2016 slide that the petroleum titles are largely limited to the Gunnedah Basin and the underlying or the adjoining Bowen Basin right up near the Queensland border. So there's been a strategic approach to move to that Gunnedah Basin and the Bowen Basin in that sort of northern part of the state. Moving on. Now if you look up the criteria that the Gateway Panel uses, I've just highlighted in red. There are other criteria that go towards agriculture and soil conditions, but I highlighted in red the water conditions. So for B-Sal, the proposed development will not significantly, and the key word there is significantly, reduce the agricultural productivity of any B-Sal biophysical cell based on the consideration of the following. And number 4 is any impacts on highly productive groundwater. And the key word there is highly productive. So the low productivity groundwater doesn't get looked at by the Gateway Panel, only the highly productive groundwaters. And these are ones that yield more than 5 litres a second and have low salinity, less than 1500 milligrams per litre. For the critical industry clusters, it's somewhat similar. It says it will not have a significant impact. So there's that word significant again. And considering reduced access to or impacts on water resources and agricultural resources. So we're fortunate in the panel, we look up the aquifer interference policy. That gives us guidance on impacts on water table, impacts on the pressure surface, impacts on salinity increases. So we have good guidance there on what to go on. Next. Now, I'm not going to go through this slide in any detail, I'll leave it with you, and if there's any questions, we'll go there. But modelling, a lot of the decisions, almost all the water decisions, are based on modelling impacts. The panel gets to look at a model that's just quite a simplistic model, but it's still a three-dimensional groundwater flow model. It has a water budget in it, and it describes how it will meet the minimal harm tests, or if it won't meet those tests, then it talks about mitigation, you know, how it's going to mitigate for its impacts. And I think the other things I'll leave to see whether there's any questions on those other aspects. Thank you very much.
That's great, George. Thanks very much for that. That's an excellent overview. And I wanted to say that both George and Ben will be speaking in a month's time at a 2-day course on on gas policy and water management. And this is a bit of a preview of that and a summary of that. So if anyone on board today is interested in that, that course, we'll shoot out the details. But thanks very much, George. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask on screen, just raise your hand and we'll organise that. I can't see any comments or questions, and it's not just about questions either. Look, if you've got a discussion or a comment you'd like to make, certainly raise your hand or put it on the Q&A icon. I'm hoping that everybody can see that icon at the bottom of the screen there. That would be great. Or else ask a live question. That's right, you can do that too. As you're going through that, George, I know one thing that I had, maybe Ben has something to say here too, but one thing that I had in mind was that with energy going only more expensive in the foreseeable future, won't we see more coal seam gas or unconventional gas applications coming in? And won't that mean the assessment times will need to crunch down less? They're going in the wrong direction for all that to happen, it seems.
Well, I might have a first go and Ben might follow up. New South Wales on coal seam gas has gone a bit quiet in the last 2 years, 18 months. It might be because the gas prices are down, and it might also be because the conditions in New South Wales are quite tough in terms of getting a licence, in terms of getting your development approvals through. It might be a combination of those two things. If gas prices come back, I think the interest will come back. And we're certainly looking at how Queensland are doing things, because they're going at a much faster pace.
Sounds good. Any thoughts on that, Ben, or any questions for George? Or is anyone else in the group?
I do have a question for George.
Yep.
George, why are we building our cities on so much valuable agricultural land? Like, there's the big concern with gas, but CSIRO came out last year and said that we're actually losing much more in terms of hectares, valuable agricultural land, to cities growing, and rather than anything to do with mining and gas.
Yes, and I guess that's a true statement. And I also note that Mary Kane, the chief scientist in New South Wales, in her report said you can have a sustainable gas industry, you know, if you follow her recommendations. And the actual land surface that it takes up is not that significant, but there is a lot of opposition to it. So the government has had to come out with quite a detailed policy setting in order to have a chance of getting some gas industry in the state. And I don't see a lot of activity at the moment. Whether it'll come back, as I say, I suspect it'll depend on prices. But the framework is certainly in place, and I guess we're probably looking to Queensland's examples of what to do and what not to do if it does come back in New South Wales, or if it does start up in New South Wales in a big way.
Well, Santos has resubmitted their EIS for the Narrabri, isn't it, up there in northern New South Wales, the gas field there? That went through in the last 24 hours. Price of gas is going up, and the Queensland government is making lots of money every week from royalties, where I think we're up to about 3 gas ships a week now heading out from the Port of Gladstone. So I can understand that other state governments will begin to look at that. And with the price of domestic gas going up, there was a movement in Queensland last week that a section of the Surat Basin has been dedicated for domestic gas production. And that might be a way that the industry expands in New South Wales over the next couple of years if a certain part of that basins you were talking about there, George, are dedicated for domestic production.
We certainly have a low, I think something like 5% of our gas usage comes from New South Wales. So I think the various ministers would be looking to see how that can be changed.
Well, look, we don't have more questions or comments, but I do encourage everyone to, but feel free to just write freely or speak on camera. That'll be good. But I think in view of that, I think we'll move straight on to the second talk by Ben. Thanks very much, Ben. Your experience in this area, in the industry in this area, is just huge, and we're so glad that you can come. Director at Aris Water, completing his PhD at Central Queensland Uni, 20 years experience in the water industry, research, built and operated a wide range of water treatment facilities. I won't read all of that bio. It
gets very boring.
but we'll be more interested in hearing what you've got to say, and thanks so much for joining us today, Ben. I'll hand right over to you.
I do notice that there's a lot more grey hair beginning to come through this goatee beard of mine. But you very kindly used of me there, Trevor.
Had to do a lot of photoshopping.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I've got a good head for radio, so I'm not sure it's particularly wise to put me up in a webinar.
Well
but,
done.
Joel, if you can move on to the next slide. What I'm going to talk about today is just coal seam gas and shale gas and the water volumes which are coming out, because the water volume is the first part of the problem. Here is a fairly typical picture of what the unconventional gas industry looks like. We've got our conventional gas reservoirs, which basically release gas without any fracking or manipulation. And that's where gas has traditionally come from in the industrial markets. But then you've got different types of unconventional gas. And these are gas reservoirs which need something else in the extraction process. Sometimes it's called fracking. The industry's beginning to think that fracking is one of those horrible F words that can't be mentioned. And on quite a few sites where I'm working at the moment, any of the underground work to liberate the unconventional gas is now called stimulations. So the industry is actually that frightened of the word fracking in movies. And the social media campaigns against fracking, that they're basically banning the word on their site, and they're moving to other terms such as stimulations. And so the Australian industry calls coal bed methane CSG, or coal seam gas, but they're the same thing. Coal bed methane is what North America terms it, and you can see that it's nice and high up there in the middle of the picture, where the coal seams going down through the aquifer and the groundwater. Down below that, you start to get into your shale gas, which has been extensively mined or extracted here in Australia, but mainly in the Cooper Basin and over in WA. So over east, we don't get to hear about it too much. I love these types of diagrams where everything's nice and neat and there's wonderful, neat lines and everything's neatly separated. But if we head on to the next slide, you can actually see that these seals and where the coal is and the oil and the different aquifers, they're all over the place. They get mixed up. There's as much geography and manipulation on underground streams and aquifer under the ground as what there is on top of the ground. And quite often we fall into a trap where we think that these seals and everything's in nice, neat layers. And when you're talking about something over the course of an entire gas lease, you can have wells which are 200 or 300 meters underneath the ground, up to 3 kilometers underneath the ground, getting into different parts of what turns out to be the same seam or the same pocket of gas, but it's going up and down depending on the underground layers and where these impervious seals are. And that's part of what makes the modelling and trying to determine exactly how much water you're going to get out of a particular well or across a field difficult. Because you might have 3 test wells in one particular area and you could, say, get 100,000 litres of water out of those wells per day. But you head into another part of the field, you get 10,000 litres of water, another part of the field, 50,000 litres of water, and as those wells age, the volumes and the water quality coming out starts to change. So yeah, it's a moving target, which makes these things very difficult. We move on to the next slide. So shale gas, commercially used since the early 1800s, and some shale rock allows for relatively easy release of the gas. And this is where the gas industry in the United States really began to take off. Now, the United States has been key to how the unconventional gas industry is expanded across the world. And basically, it started in the 1970s with the oil crisis, where the USA became dependent on energy coming out of the Middle East. The tap was turned off, huge amounts of political pressure. And so the United States decided that it's going to become energy independent of the rest of the world. And they put billions upon billions of dollars of federal government grants into this project over decades. And year after year after year after year, it didn't work. Up until about 5 years ago, when it started to work magically well. And that's where the coal bed methane came from, and the shale gas industry. And shale gas is much, much bigger in the United States than what the CSG industry is. Whereas here in Australia, the coal seam gas industry is bigger than shale. But it's just the ease of access for the different gases in the different continents, I suppose. But another thing to think about is that, you know, CSG and shale gas has expanded to a great deal in the United States, call it over the last decade. Donald Trump's now president of the United States, and he's been publicly saying all through his presidential election campaign that he's going to significantly increase the amount of federal government funding for the unconventional gas industry in the United States. And that means that however big it is now, if it gets that type of federal support, and there's already been pipelines which have been highly controversial pipelines which have been stopped by Barack Obama by executive orders, Donald Trump's already issued counteracting executive orders to release those pipelines. So the unconventional gas industry is once again going to get a big boost in the United States. And what happens in the United States tends to impact the rest of the world, particularly in forms of extraction and new techniques. And just here in Australia in the last 18 months, in Queensland, where I've been working predominantly in the CSG industry, there are new well drilling techniques coming out of the United States just recently, which have massively increased the performance of new wells. So a lot more gas coming out of each well which is going down, but it's also meant that the volume of water in each well going down has increased significantly. And that's throwing all of our models out as far as what we thought was going to happen. And you get this in an emerging industry where things are new, things are expanding, new techniques coming in all the time. We've got big changes that occur in the extraction techniques. Whereas if you think about something like an open cut coal mine, the drag lines that were doing the job 20 years ago are still the drag lines which are doing the job today. The pace of improvements in technologies in our traditional forms of mining, such as coal, gas extraction seems to be moving much, much quicker. So tight gas, it's very costly in Australia. It's mainly offshore gas and requires substantial fracking of the rock reservoir to release it. So tight gas doesn't seem to have too much in the way of commercial extraction in Australia. Coal seam gas or coal bed methane gas, huge reserves in Australia with all of our coal deposits. And this is the part of the gas industry in Australia which is pushing ahead in a major way. So Joel, next slide. So this is one of those fairly horrible pictures that we see about the CSG industry with the number of wells which is going up. All I really want you to get from this slide is that there's gas lines basically going through every one of those dirt roads from every one of those pads. And they head to extraction points, such as the big liquid natural gas plant at Gladstone. And they will transport that gas hundreds of kilometres, up to 1,000 kilometres, to get it to Gladstone to be able to export it. Where every one of those gas pipes are is basically a water pipe going from each of those wells as well. And water is an expense in the gas industry, makes them no money, costs money. And it's lucky if you get water pumped more than 30 or 40 kilometres. So for every big collection of wells like this, somewhere nearby, you'll actually have a decentralized water treatment plant, which will be treating all of the water which is coming out of those wells. Next slide. Shale gas is a bit different in respect that you'll have one major pad, and you'll have much, much deeper frac layers or extraction points, and coming back to the one centralized pad. So, and that's part of the cost and the efficiency of having to go much, much deeper in the well. But shale gas tends to have a much less physical impact on the environment. Next slide. This is one of the standard graphs which are used to determine water production out of coal seam gas. And I've mentioned it before, and I think even George has chipped me over the back of the head for it, that I dislike this graph because it has everything going in a wonderful... so if we have a look at the left-hand side of the graph, we've got peak water as the well is absolutely brand new, and the water declines over time. And as the water decline, as you move towards the right-hand side of the graph, you get more gas out of the well. And it's a wonderful thing to start modeling off, and it explains that when the well is new, it's when you get your peak water. As the well ages, water decreases and the gas volume increases. But the water quality actually tends to get an awful lot worse, particularly the salinity of the water as that well ages. So you might have something starting off at maybe 2,000 or 3,000 microsiemens electrical conductivity when the well goes in. If it's a good well, might be 6 or 7 microsiemens if it's in a more saline groundwater. But by the time you get over to the right-hand side of the graph, even though you're getting less volumes of water, the salinity of that water might be up at 20 to 25,000 microsiemens. And that's actually a much more difficult water to treat and reuse, and it produces a brine, which is much harder to get rid of. The mass balance of salt is much higher. The other thing is that no well in the CSG industry is typically left to work its 20 years of life without a workover crew coming through. And what a workover crew does is that as the well ages, you get all sorts of sediment and rust and corrosion in the pipelines and in the extraction points down in the actual coal seam where the gas is supposed to get into the pipework so that it can be extracted. So they come along and they clean that out, and then they clean it out using high pressure, lots of acids, things which will basically take any of the metal corrosion, turn them into a soluble form, and get them up out of that well so that the gas volume will go back up. But that also means that periodically, over time, the water volume goes up on this graph as well as a well ages. And typically a workover crew will go through a well every 2 to 3 years, depending on the corrosion rate in the particular area that you are. So a well that might be producing 10,000 litres a day will suddenly produce 30 or 40,000 litres of water a day, and it'll have significant forms of iron in there, up over 100 milligrams per litre. Salinity of the water will be up at 25,000, 30,000 microsiemens, and the pH of that water will be down to 3 or 4. And that produces treatment challenges because you've set up a treatment plant which is actually designed to treat a different quality and a different volume of water. So it's a moving target. If we head on to the next slide, please. This is the simplified version of the model used to determine how much water is going to come out of a single gas well in the coal seam gas industry in Queensland. And as you can see, there are so many different interrelated and correlated impacts on what's going on in a particular well. And I'm a big believer in Newtonian science. So every reaction has a positive and equal reaction. So you do a workover crew on a well, that has an impact. You put another well down in the same aquifer, the same area, a couple of kilometers away, that actually changes some of the pressures within the aquifer, that has an impact. You start storing the water coming out of that well for a long period of time in a detention bay before a water treatment plant, and suddenly you've got biological life in that water. You've got algae, you've got ducks. Suddenly the algae is taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So whole ranges of things. And yeah, it's actually really complex to try and work out the volume of water that you're going to get from a particular gas lease. And determining, when you're building a water treatment plant, volume's key as far as making sure that you're not undersized, oversized, that you can deal with the peak flows. And no gas operator is going to be very happy with you if a well's got to be turned off, because if a well has to be turned off, it's actually quite expensive, time-consuming, and not always successful if that well needs to be turned back on. So yeah, it gets very complicated, and it's a issue which is constantly changing. We can go on to the next slide. So using that model before, the blue line on these particular graphs are what the modeled productions from wells using the model on the previous slide was going to show in regards to water volumes over the course of between 2005 and 2010. And the green lines indicate the actual real volume that came out of that well. Right? And a good friend of mine, Ted Gardner, he's got a great saying about models, which he's, you know, liberated from somebody else. But all models are wrong, but some are useful. And what we're trying to do with these models, as far as being able to predict the amount of groundwater coming out of CSG wells, is ground truth them. So the more wells that go down, the more that we do this type of modeling on, the more real data that we can put into the models and predict out like this. Now, you may say that that graph on the right, when you have a look at the real water production being so much higher than the modeled production, is an issue. In some ways it's an issue, but it's also a wonderful learning experience to be able to go back to that model and say, well, this is what we put in, this is the model prediction, this is the real data. Why isn't the model acting as expected in the real world? And ground truthing that model will be able to get much more effective forecasts of what a particular gas lease is going to produce. But this is the stage of the industry that we're in. And as I'm sitting here speaking to you, one of my private bits of work outside of IceWarm, I'm currently trying to work out how to expand a water treatment plant, which was supposed to reach peak production in December 2018 and has already gone past its peak production in December 2016. So the new drilling techniques that I was talking about there before, which have liberated a lot more gas from each well, they've also meant that there's a lot more water. So water treatment plants all throughout Queensland at the moment are being updated to be able to handle these increased flows and changes, not just in the volumes, but the chemistry of the water that we've got coming through. Next slide, please, Joel. So shale, which we'll go into in the second day of the training course that we've got coming up. The major thing that I want to talk to you about shale is coal seam gas produces an awful lot of water, which has got to find somewhere to go. There's no such magic place as a way. So that water needs to be treated. The beneficial part of the water can be reused. The brine, the salinity part of that water needs to find a suitable dispersal or disposal point. Shale water cycle is actually very different. It's a net consumer of water during the first 60 to 120 days. But after that, it actually needs water. So it's not producing water that needs to be disposed of, whether it's into, say, the Dawson River or the Murray-Darling or pumped back down into an aquifer. It actually needs water after about the first 60 to 120 days worth of production. And in Australia, in an industry which is an agricultural industry, which in many ways is water scarce, where shale gas is going to move in, it's not so much that they're going to produce water which has got nowhere to go or that needs significant treatment before it can be used successfully in agriculture. They're actually seeking forms of water that can be used to help keep the gas extraction over the next 5 to 40 years. And I think that's going to be a very different argument to what we've heard so far in Australia, is where agriculture and the gas industry will be competing for the same limited resource. part of me would like to think that some of the water produced from coal seam gas could actually go into the shale water cycle, because most of it is of the right water quality, and you could have one industry working, say, between 200 meters and a kilometer, and another industry working 3 kilometers down, and the waste product, the water from the CSG industry, is actually helping the shale industry meet its production targets. But that might just be me being far, far too optimistic. I think that's pretty much all I've got to say today, Trevor. Thank you for the opportunity.
Ben, that's fantastic. A great sweep of interesting stuff across that whole issue of shale extraction and coal seam gas extraction. We've got a couple of questions, and we have about 5 minutes before the end of the 45 minutes is up. We might go a touch over in this process, but let's try and keep it tight, everyone. Quick but short answers as possible. But look, I'll read these questions out, if you like, Ben and George, and maybe you can respond live right now. The impact that the first one is the impact that the agriculture industry has on the environment, particularly water, is higher than the gas industry. Can more be done to facilitate the social license to operate gas projects in New South Wales? Probably yours, George. Oh, George, your mic's off. Here we go. Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, I certainly agree with the first statement, because coal seam gas is pretty small in New South Wales, and the two areas that it's operating, down in Camden and up near Narrabri, they're not pulling a lot of water because they're taking it out of Permian sediments, which are a lot tighter than the Jurassic sediments that Queensland pull their water out of. So there's not the same amount of water to be dealt with, but there's still mining companies, coal seam gas companies, certainly as far as the social license is concerned, have an uphill battle. You know, I guess the high ground's been taken by people who don't want to see these industries, and I guess, you know, if you want to get that sort of industry up, you need to have some local champions that can champion the cause, and they'll probably only do that if they're going to benefit out of it financially, and that they can see their land coming back to high productivity within 20 to 30 years. So I don't know what the answer is. Coal seam gas in New South Wales has certainly lost ground considerably. A lot of the mining impacts I would have thought would be seen as higher, but like coal mining impacts, but that's not the way the general public really view the problem. And again, you know, Queensland's out of the starting blocks, and, you know, 5 or even 10 years ahead of New South Wales.
Yep. Ben, thoughts?
Queensland failed to get the industry up in the 70s, and again in the 80s, and again in the 90s. And yeah, what really got the industry going here in Queensland, or one of the major reasons, was that we've got so many open cut coal mines and underground coal mines, and they all need to be degassed as part of the traditional means of mining. And when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, where a lot of those fugitive emissions from the traditional mines just used to be vented off to the atmosphere, we started putting in a lot of flares. Like, there were some country roads only 100 k's away from where I'm sitting now. You didn't need your headlights driving along them at night, because there was an open cut coal mine on one side and an underground coal mine on the other, and they were flaring so much off these mines to reduce the emissions that it was almost like driving in daylight. But the people sat back and went, well, heat equals energy, energy equals money. And so instead of flaring a lot of these emissions off to the atmosphere, people started harvesting the gas. Gas-fired generators started becoming a lot cheaper. So coal mines started producing their own gas-fired electricity. A gas well next to an open-cut coal mine, which is 50 kilometres long, is got very little visual impact compared to what's historically there. And a lot of these mines in Queensland that I'm talking about, they're decades old. Some are getting close to a century old that they've been mining areas. So it's not seen as something new as such, or a new industry. It's just seen as a variant of an old industry which is there. And I think that's part of what's happened in New South Wales, is gas has tried to move into areas where there wasn't big mining industries in the past, or the mining industries that were there were fairly contained and didn't impact a whole heap of stakeholders. And that people react differently to things when they're reacting to something which is new, rather than a variant of an old lived experience. And I think that psychology is impacting on there at the moment. And if you think about the best gas basin, which is got the biggest history in Australia, there in the Cooper Basin in the northern part of South Australia, you know, Santos. SA in Santos stands for South Australia. Santos has successfully extracted gas, and they've used fracking techniques up in the Cooper Basin for decades, and they've had very little adverse publicity about it, because there's all of about 3 or 4 stakeholders in the middle of a desert. So people react very differently, react emotionally when they can see something going to happen in their backyard. And I think one of the other issues is the New South Wales gas industry tried to work an awful lot closer to the coast. And when you work close to the coast, you can actually do saltwater disposal of a lot of these industries, a lot of the wastewater from, say, a coal seam gas proposal, which is absolutely the cheapest way to go. But the closer you move to the coast in Australia, the smaller the box of land, the more stakeholders you've got. And but majority of gas extraction in Queensland, where it's been successful, is between 200 and 400 kilometres off the coast. Big properties next to existing mines, and
knocks the social license around quite a bit.
So and we've had to approach our water management issues in a completely different way. It's all decentralized water treatment plants, and so no saltwater disposal.
No, thank you for that.
There about Trump.
There is a second question, although Trump has reinvigorated, maybe we'll make this the last question. We've just gone beyond the 45-minute mark, but that's okay. Maybe if people can just hang on for a bit longer. Although Trump has reinvigorated the gas industry in the US, with Australia signing, and I believe now ratified, the Paris Agreement, there will be foreseeable impacts to the gas industry. What foreseeable impacts do you see for the gas industry in Australia? So maybe George or Ben,
Yesterday at the National Press Club, Prime Minister Turnbull was talking about being agnostic as far as the way that we achieve lower emissions. And in part, he was talking about the need for clean coal, and that the Clean Energy Future Fund shouldn't just invest in solar and wind, but that clean coal needed to be expanded there. He mentioned gas as well, because we've actually got to do something about making sure that we secure our domestic gas supply, and that's been an ongoing conversation in Australia for the last 3 or 4 years. But gas emissions, or gas-fired power stations, have much lower emissions than even the best clean coal plants, which are being talked about scratched out on whiteboards across the country at the moment. And we do have lots of gas. So I think the gas industry in Australia is going to expand in 2 ways. One is we've got an export market set up, and where Queensland government's making money from it. Never stand between a premier and a bucket of money, is Paul Keating's famous political saying about the state premiers. So eventually the other state premiers will see the bucket of money from exporting gas, and there'll be an expansion that way. Securing the domestic supply. Western Australia has secured their domestic supply, but nothing's really happened along the eastern seaboard. So that will come. And part of what happened in South Australia with the reliability of power, there'll be a push on there, because where Adelaide lost power last year, and Trevor's nodding his hand. This year, for people
24 hours of one episode, and 36 on the next one. Within 4 months of each other.
For his birthday, I'm buying Trevor a box of candles, because he lives in South Australia.
I need a bigger generator.
that will help Trevor. But the gas-fired power stations, which are in South Australia, where Trevor is at the moment, they are actually in shutdown mode because of the price of domestic gas. When the power went out in South Australia. So securing a larger percentage of gas and lowering the domestic price of gas, or at least putting in wholesale arrangements to secure the reliability of power so that gas-fired power stations are providing baseload power in places like South Australia, is going to be another area. And the third is where we sign up to Paris agreements, and I can see that gas will be used as a transition energy source to provide baseload power to meet our international obligations between now. The 2020 goals are not that hard to meet. The 2030 goals are not that hard to meet, but the 2050 goals are incredibly hard to meet unless we find over the course of the next decade better storage options for renewable energy, whether it's wind, solar, or hydro. So I can see gas playing a transitional role as far as those international agreements.
Yeah, no, that's very good thoughts. And George, did you have any on that as well, on that second question?
Oh, just some final comments. I think any development, whether it be coal seam gas or coal mining, has impacts, and it's just a matter of the community considering whether the impacts outweigh the benefits, and we have processes to do that. And it's just that we don't bring the community along all the time when we get approvals, and the community thinks that most things get approved. But they do get a very close look at those ones that do get approved, and not all of them get approved. So I guess the coal seam gas industry still has a way to go to convince the community that they can do it in a reasonably safe manner.
Yep, yeah, that'll make sense. Any closing thoughts from yourself, Ben? Otherwise, we'll press right on.
No, I think I've talked enough, but I'm looking forward to talking more in Canberra in early March.
Yeah, no, we're looking forward to that. Thanks everyone for participating today. I see the list of people who've been on board for the entire 45 minutes, so there must have been quite a bit of interest. There wasn't people coming and going out there. That was very rich scientifically and policy-wise. George, Ben, thanks so much for all of that. Reminder to everyone, if you can fill a feedback form that should appear on your screen when you close out, and there'll be a link to today's recording sent to you after the session. And the next webinar that iSwarm does will, to be advised, we'll let you know about that. But you can start to date with iSwarm on Twitter at iSwarm. That would be very good. The last thing is the access to the course next month. I've put it up on the chat line if you want to look at that, everyone, but we'll include it in our email to everybody at the end. I think we're there. And look, thanks everybody for joining us today. It's been absolutely brilliant and a really great summary of coal seam gas and shale gas policy and water management. All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, George. Thanks very much, Ben.
Thanks, Trevor.
Yep. Great.
Everybody.
See you again. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.